Good evening, everybody. My name is Steve Hunt, and I'm the director of the School of Communication at Illinois State University. We are thrilled to have you join us tonight for Election Night Live, which is a virtual watch party for the 2022 midterm elections that is organized and presented by the Extending Empathy Project and the American Democracy Project, both of which you'll hear much more about later on tonight. So before we get into the details and start talking about the election in great detail and depth, why don't we introduce the people that are joining us on the panel tonight. We'll have a series of people that are here with us in the SMAC, as well as speakers that are joining us from around the country. So I'll start first with Dr. Byron Craig, and I would ask what your interest is in the American Democracy Project, the Extending Empathy Project, and everything happening here tonight.
Sure. So thanks for having us. Thanks for joining in this evening. So as Dr. Hunt said, I'm Dr. Byron Craig, and my area of expertise is really race and rhetoric. And my interest really in the Extending Empathy Project that Dr. George so kindly brought me in on. So I'm always questioning empathy, and I'm always questioning about what can empathy be. And so that's really how I approach it, how I approach this notion of empathy. And I'll just give us an example, just briefly. I've now seen the film Till twice, and for those who don't know, it's about Emmett Till, and mostly about his mother's decision to show his body. And so one of the things I thought about while watching that film was really the lack of empathy that was shown to Black folk during that time, right? And we're seeing kind of a resurgence of that. Not that, I don't know if it really went away. And so it really makes me think about in this election and the rhetoric we've heard during this election, and kind of the racist comments that have made during this election also. So I'm always kind of questioning, right, what can empathy be? Not that I don't believe in empathy, but questioning what it should be and how it can become better. So that's really my interest in how I look at this. So.
All right, well, my name is Dr. Steve Rocco. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Comm. I approach the question of the American Democracy Project and the Empathy Project as something that is kind of intertwined. And I think as we're entering this midterm election cycle, I think it's important for us to see how they need to be intertwined. We've seen a lot of pundit commentary. We've seen a lot of people stress a concern that American democracy is in a state of crisis. Where the seams are kind of falling or fraying, if you will. And I think for me the question becomes, what does empathy mean and what should it be in an era where American democracy is so marked by its polarization, right? It's so marked by a potential kind of legitimacy crisis, depending on what the results are in some of these elections across the country. This is the first election, as many have noted, since January 6th, from the violent insurrection at the Capitol. And it remains to be seen what the legacy of that event is in the context of what kind of developments we see tonight. Are there any kind of tea leaves or indicators that might give us an idea of where things are going in this country, whether civil discourse can be repaired, what that looks like. And so I'm looking forward to diagnosing this with a lot of very smart people. So.
Well, I'm Dr. Scott Jordan, Chair of the Department of Psychology. I'm thrilled to be here with my fantastic colleagues from the School of Communication. For me, the Extended Empathy Project is an effort to examine how we might, in fact, find a way to get out of what I'll call cultural phase transition we're in right now. We have two very different views of the world that are really in competition in our government right now. And as we'll talk about over the course of the evening, many things are being done to keep those groups isolated and very robustly othering, and in negative ways, the other group, which is exactly the opposite of how empathy works. So for me, it's kind of the sense of, instead of joining that foray and becoming negative, trying to find ways to actually keep hope alive by examining empathy. And then maybe, as we'll talk tonight, one of my missions is to stop looking at empathy and racism as things that exist in our head and look at them as things that are sustained by an infrastructure that we create that keeps those things in our lives. So I'm thrilled to be here. And Dr. Hunt, please say a few things about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm also thrilled to be here, and really grateful to see this relationship between psychology and the School of Communication and the others that are involved in the Extending Empathy Project come to light. Really happy about the partnership we have with the National American Democracy Project. And by the way, this stream was made available to all 250 plus schools that are affiliated with that project. So hopefully some of them were able to tune in tonight. I think it's, as everybody else has said, it's just a really critical time for us as a culture right now, for our democracy. And today's been kind of a whirlwind for me personally, of ups and downs, from excitement to anxiety and worry about where we are. But those are the kinds of things that we'll get into tonight. And by the way, I should say that if you're tuning in thinking that we're calling horse races tonight, that's not what we're doing. There's plenty of that happening on traditional media tonight. But what we're really doing is engaging in deeper conversations about the themes that are related to what's happening with the midterm elections right now. And as I mentioned in the introduction, we'll have speakers from across the country that will tune in and join the conversation. We have students represented in the SMAC tonight. We'll also have a chance to tune in to our partners at Heartland Community College to see how their election night is going as well. So we look forward to all of that. As I said before, we're broadcasting from the school's YouTube site. This is available to everyone in the public. And we hope people will tune in as we go along. So maybe this is a good transition point for me to turn it back to the panel to just kind of think about, what are your thoughts on where we are with the election right now? And we mentioned that we're in this kind of post-January 6th environment. We're in a culture that is problematic on a number of levels, and maybe there's hope going forward, but where are you all now? What are your thoughts coming into this election tonight?
Well, I can start. So, I think for me, I've been on edge the whole time with elections, right? And as I said earlier, I'm my area is race and rhetoric, and I'm also an affiliate professor in the African American Studies program as well. So, I've been a little bit on edge. I'll say I remain hopeful, right? I think there's some, good candidates. For me, no matter who, I'm hoping, I have people that I want to win, but I'm really hopeful with seeing the number of people who actually put themselves on the line to run for office, right? That is where I remain hopeful about it, right? But at the same time, I'm very cautious because of how the Supreme Court's looking right now, and the possibilities of how it can look in the future, and thinking about some of the things that are going on with some of the opinions that are coming out of the Supreme Court, the decisions coming out of the Supreme Court. That's a real big concern for me. We hear a lot about abortion. There's also a lot at stake with affirmative action, which I always get concerned about when they start striking down things, how that can trickle down, like the trickle down effects of that with other laws and legislations that have been on the books. And I'll just say again, just because I think this film is so powerful, till at the end of that film, right, we hear about the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act just being, passed in this past March, right? And Till was lynched, 67 years ago, right? And the fact that there's still the woman who accused him of this is still living, right, without any kind of penalty or accountability. So, for me, all that kind of boils down to how we're voting and who we're electing in office, right? To kind of think about how we chart how we move forward, right? Who's in office, and we know that a lot of people who are running for office are saying things that, we still have the issue with what people think is CRT or critical race theory. And I'm sure a lot of these people who are running will still kind of bring those up as issues, right? And so that's what becomes frightening for me. But at the same time, being in the classroom and talking to students, right? You hear their views, and the classes that I teach, especially my undergrad class, they're very vocal about what they want to see happen, and that's encouraging to me.
Yeah.
To hear them talking and see them being so politically active. I have a number of students in my race and visual rhetoric course, who were out on the quad with Pritzker, and what's his name? Durbin were here, right? Holding up their signs and really being vocal about the things they want to see happen. So, that has to give you hope, I think, right? I think each generation says that, right? It gives you hope. So, so I'm hopeful. I remain hopeful with that, right? But I will say, as an African American male who identifies as queer, we're in a very rocky culture right now, very frightening time for both of those ways that I identify. Right? So things we can talk about later as we go on, and I think, probably Dr. Hintz will probably get into a good discussion about that also. We can talk a little bit more about it.
Well, I think there's a lot of themes, there's a lot of things on my mind for this particular event tonight and the ensuing days, because I think the reality is the ballots will be counted for many days after our broadcast is over, right? We're used to, I think for most of American history, with maybe the lone exception being the 2000 election, at least in the kind of the era of kind of mass broadcasting, right? We were used to getting results and outcomes in one night, and that's really not the case anymore. I think that there's going to be a lot of very contested elections, very close elections, and they're going to be litigated. There's already litigation right now, and so that'll delay this. And I think that that's sort of, to me, what's important as kind of the under the surface here is this kind of specter of violence, political violence, which is not new to the United States, but it's also taken a different form, and it seems to have been supercharged by social media and online connectivity. And that's something that I think we all have to be aware of. I'm sure we're going to get into this discussion. But I think that if you're thinking about the responses to, say, the assault on Nancy Pelosi's husband, Paul Pelosi, right, and the kind of intention of that attacker when he arrived, right, where's Nancy? Political violence is nothing new, but it seems like we're in a dangerous moment where this is becoming increasingly normalized in ways that are not healthy for any kind of democratic society. And I think that that's something that as college faculty, as those who take civic engagement seriously, we need to be mindful of. I think the other thing that's important to keep in mind also is, I guess you're talking about your students. I think when I think about our students, I think these elections and the legacy of what this project, this kind of project of associated living of democratic experimentation in the United States is going to hinge on whether or not this Generation Z actually has confidence that it can be maintained, right? And I think that right now if you're looking at the kind of polarization, if you're looking at the kind of practices and normalization of political violence, if you have then also this concentrated leadership in a class of politicians and also kind of like members, broadly speaking, of the kind of upper class of the establishment that are clearly kind of at a certain age where there's a distance between them, right? I think about like Chuck Grassley. I think about people who were like honestly probably should have retired years ago. And I'm not trying to be ageist. I'm really not. But I do think that if we're serious, we're honest, there is enough of an age deficit where you have to wonder, are these people thinking about the same things that matter for these other generations that are just emerging, right? And if there's sort of a chokehold on leadership positions. Right, I'm teaching a course on leadership right now. I think that to me is something that has to be taken seriously, right? Because there's so many different chokeholds on who can actually assume public leadership in the United States because of the political economy of elections. But then also, once people assume power, how easy it is to maintain it because of the way in which this system has been designed. And so I think those are concerns to me that are sort of under the surface that, yeah, the results will indicate one thing or another. But to me, that these are the things under the surface that we need to be mindful of. And if we don't have kind of appropriate channels for people to voice their concerns that are productive, right, then where does that energy go?
Yeah.
And if it goes into violent outcomes, then that's when this whole project is really at risk. And that's what I think we have to be mindful of.
Yeah. Can I just
Please go ahead.
comment on something? I just want to kind of go back to the political violence part that you talked about, and I think that's probably what I was trying to get to when I was talking a little bit earlier, but I get concerned about this, trickle down violence, right? For me, when we saw that attack on Paul Pelosi, that immediately makes me think about how that opens up the door for other types of violent acts, right? That I would still consider political. That it opens up that door for more violence on LGBTQ people, right, or African Americans, or on women, right, or international students and people here internationally. So that's something I've been thinking about with this political violence, right? How that can trickle down, how that opens a door for other types of violence to start happening again, right? And so I think that's when I was expressing this kind of fear I have, and also thinking about going back to what can empathy be, right? This is something I think we have to really think about seriously, and it kind of goes, and I know you'll talk about this, got into our theme for the Extending Empathy project this year.
Right. Well, you guys have put two major themes on the table. One is this idea of trickle-down violence, and the other is our students. And I put a lot of my faith in our students, and I think it's important that we coach them on two things. One is to be active so that you express agency. Because it's in those moments, those hesitant moments of non-agency, when we choose not to act, when we may not feel like we have something to say, that's where despair begins and hope dies, right? Take action. When we take action, our brain wraps it all up in our own little bubble. But when we don't take action, we sit there and we take the world in terms of what it gives us. So creating a thought, being out in the world, having students show up as signs, that's expressing agency. That's creating their own bubbles for how to be in this world, and that's how they that's how we keep ourselves away from despair. And I do think younger people need some coaching, and I'm going to say straight up coaching, that when they're doing their activist work, their job is not to persuade individual minds. I went to high school some years ago and spoke to what was called a culture council. These were young high school students who had been selected by the administration to do workshops on social justice issues. And one young man asked me, what am I supposed to do if they won't listen? And I said, that's not your job. Your job is to be present, to express a value, express your agency collectively, and be a part of their environment. They will choose someday whether or not they want to go and be part of what you're doing. But if we don't have that in the world, no one's going to see a different way to go. Our activists, our young people get too burnt out because they do expend a lot of energy now, and then maybe some elections at a big level don't go their way, and they connect that to their actions. That's not their responsibility. Their responsibility, if they're act in your space and act as you know. And, of course, find good mentors. And that's, of course, what college is all about, right? Expanding your sense of what it is that you want to act for. So that's where my hope is. And that also ties into this notion of political violence because, earlier I said we're in a phase transition, and I think it's real. I think demographically we find things changing in this country clearly by 2050. And we've also seen a sort of, I'm going to use the phrase, and please correct me as I'm not an economist, but we've seen a reorganization of the American middle class over the last 50 years that has taken away the sort of middle class union life that used to be the norm. So people are not in the same financial straits they were 30, 40 years ago. Their families aren't in the same financial straits. Coupled with other things, there's a lot of fear. And that gets tapped into by people wanting power. So yesterday, Donald Trump called Nancy Pelosi an animal. Now, why would he do that? One can say he's trying to be mean. But what he's really doing is telling everybody that she's not worth moral consideration. He's dehumanizing her, making her less than human. And what that does is when you dehumanize people, you reduce the assumption that they're worthy of moral consideration, and you morally disengage from them as entities. And this affords the space for violence. It's when we have people speaking out that that's not what you want to do if you want to respect yourself. That's not what you want to do if you want to be a respectable person. That's meant to get them to once again reconsider certain people, as worthy of moral consideration. So this dehumanization that goes on is the psychology is to not be empathetic, to create borders on your cognitive bubbles that afford you not to have to empathize, and it'll afford you the ability to morally disengage, and that affords and creates a collective context that makes violence increasingly possible.
Can I just add one thing you said? I think that bringing up Trump's comments, and he's not the only one. I mean, there's a whole kind of troll.
There were people that called some people the despicables, right?
Exactly.
I mean, it's not on.
Course,
It's both parties.
Of course, of course. But I do think though that what you're speaking to is something that is kind of baking into the system as it's unfolding, as it's kind of manifesting, and that's something that I think we have to check very carefully, and we have to as citizens, and I think as educators be very mindful of that, because I think what you're describing is the kind of institutional incentivizing of this. There is a media net. We're living in a context of social media. We're living in a context of polarization where that dehumanization is incentivized, and that's the real problem. It's and to the extent that it's incentivized by all these different kinds of structural forces, that's when you have a situation where a scholar in our field, Jeremy Inglis, called enemyship. And that's when you really begin to see a democratic system fall apart. And it can fall apart from a number of directions. It can succumb to demagoguery, right, which is what you saw, of course, in the classical era, among other places. But I think that's I think what you're describing is the incentivizing of this, and that kind of perverse incentive systems, right? As any good social scientist will tell you, right, creates kind of behavioral outcomes, and that's what we're seeing and what we're grappling with, and that's what we have to be very, very mindful of.
But it's interesting though, because it's interesting to hear you two talk about that, because I'm sitting over here thinking, but that's nothing new, right? I mean, white America has dehumanized Black America since we were forced to come over on ships, right? And so it's almost, for me, it's kind of this rebaking it into the system, right? Or unearthing what was already there, right? And so re-incentivizing this, and so it's interesting to think about, in that way that we could look back at this, and could we predict it? Maybe that this was going to happen again, or that this was boiling up to begin happening again. I mean, this time it's taking foot in in our politics, and again, like you said, this is we've had political violence before. But it just seems like now there's something that really, we can really connect this to, to slavery, right? And to, how do you make slavery okay, right? You dehumanize, Black people, right? Or people who are from Africa, I should say, right? You dehumanize them so you don't have to engage with them or have that empathy toward them, right? So it's kind of this thing happening over again, right? But now we see it happening in our in our politics more openly, and I think that's probably one of the reasons, one of the ways that it's excuse me, become so okay, maybe for some people, because like I said earlier, I have this fear about it, that it's almost, if we start doing this, then we can continue, then we can start, finding ways to dehumanize the other, right? So I don't know. I just wanted to add that in. Okay.
No, I think that's a good point, and I think that that's one of the reasons why we have to kind of try to historicize and contextualize this, because you're right. I mean, like there were incentives then, and there are incentives now, and I think that the difference, of course, is that we're in an era that's purportedly, claims to be beyond this. Right, and I think that's it's the afterlife, as Hartman and others would say, it's slavery in the afterlife of slavery, right? But that's I think the difference here is that we're living under kind of discursive norms that we are committed, at least rhetorically, to a set of values that decries this, but nonetheless you see the legacy of it, you see the echoes of it, and that's what becomes. Again, that's what we have to be mindful of.
Hey, can I interrupt really quick? We
Yeah.
actually have a question from YouTube right now.
Okay.
This is from Dr. Pedro, who asks, would you please address the roles of emotional argument and rational argument in political campaigns? And what are the consequences on our nation at all levels?
Can I throw down on that real
Of course,
quick?
go for it.
Yeah.
There's a lot to say
Because a
about
lot
that.
of the stuff, a lot of the dehumanization we see going on in the current conversation is not about policy at all.
No.
It's not about rationalism. It's not about cognition. It's about affect.
Yeah.
And the easiest way to turn off your thoughts is to get mad. And people that can capitalize on that, get people mad, build systems that keep people mad. And as they keep people mad, they end up becoming, dare I say, fairly obedient. So this is not a policy war we're seeing. This is an affect war. That's sustaining other things than arguments about policy. I think it's sustaining a certain level of white supremacy that some feel is at risk by some of the changes that we've seen going on in our culture in the last, I would say the last 30, 40 years, as people from underrepresented groups have gotten more economic, political power and have had the means to make their voices present in the public conversation in ways they weren't present before. Well, no wonder the 50s were pleasant. There was one group talking, right? Now we have multiple groups talking. It's perturbing to some. And what I do want to say in terms of the notion of hope is that as a systems theorist, these kind of perturbations and these system reorganizations is how it goes. It's how it happens. And you're going to have a strong clinging to an old, in a systems theory we call it order parameter, but an old system as a new system is emerging, and that struggle is what's called a phase transition, and the tensions between them are what we're living in. So I don't see a lot of rational debate going on. I see a lot of affect.
Yeah. No, go.
Okay.
Go.
So it's funny. I think it's a great question, because actually we just talked about this in my classical rhetoric course, and I guess depending on what theory you'd like to go to, I think if you were to consult, say, like an Aristotle, pointed out, among others, that the binary between rational and emotional argument is one that's sort of a false binary. Right, because pathos is always endemic to any kind of appeal, and I think that maybe to maybe rephrase the question, what are the emotions that are most politically efficacious, and why do you keep seeing them? Right, because I think what's incentivized within what we would call negative campaigning is clearly a hyper emphasis on fear and anger.
Yep.
Right. I mean, those are the two. And Aristotle in his own day recognized the importance of anger, right, as a driving kind of affect. Because the idea here is, the way you think about the rationality and emotions is that the emotions have to be appealed to and kind of evoked in order to prepare the audience for some kind of a rational argument, right? I mean, you can make you can make demagogic arguments that take a kind of like there's a logic to it. Do you know what I mean? right? There are syllogisms being used, but it's the kind of psychological context that one is receiving those arguments in terms of that then drives action, that motivates behavior. And so it's been a long-standing debate. I mean, Machiavelli put on the table, right? Better to be feared than loved, right? And it's not a surprise then that you're seeing these.
Yes.
And I think the problem though is that we have a culture that is so predicated on these kinds of driving emotions. And I think the question here is, what emotions would actually need to be evoked in order to repair this divide? And I don't think anybody has a crystal ball. I mean, that's kind of the most important question of our time, because that's I mean, you have to ask yourself, what stories do we tell as a people? What emotions have to be evoked that can actually rehumanize those who have been dehumanized?
So I'm just going to say that that's a fantastic framing, and the emotion that we talk about in psychology is epistemic emotions, emotions that generate an approach and curiosity response, as opposed to a avoid and not listen response. And so, interesting enough, surprise is a way to achieve approach. And then one final thing I want to say, this that we're doing right here, this is how we generate epistemic emotions. This is what our young people need to see us doing, is struggling with these issues at a level that's both impassioned and reasoned. And not seeing us collapse into these dehumanizing binaries that just feed into the tornadoes. Are we going to Zoom now?
Yeah, we can go to Zoom.
All right. So everyone out there, it's my dear pleasure. It's my good pleasure to introduce my dear friend, Dr. Emilio Lobato, our former master's student in the Cognitive Behavioral Sciences program here at Illinois State University in the Department of Psychology. Went on to the University of California, Merced. Recently obtained his PhD. Emilio, no, you didn't. I'm sorry, I thought you did.
I'm doing that this year.
You're doing that this year. Fantastic. Yeah. So the reason that I've invited Emilio to be here tonight is because he's an expert in conspiracy theories. So I've asked him to come in, say a few things about conspiracy theories in relation to our current context, and then if we can spin it into the notion of reframing hope, I'd love to. But for now, Emilio, the floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you all very much for having me. This is, as somebody who studies more broadly misinformation rather than specifically conspiracy theories, this has been a very busy few years for me, as for the whole field. And it's, for me, one of the things that has come to my eyes in the last few years with COVID, with the respective elections, our current one, the 2021, and even going as far back as the 2016 and 2018 presidential and midterm elections, is looking at conspiracy ideation and conspiracy beliefs through the lens of systems. Rather than looking at them as individual beliefs that sort of exist in a vacuum, how do these beliefs connect to the other kinds of beliefs we have? In particular, a lot of the conspiracy ideation that we hear today does connect to a lot of sort of historical pseudoscience claims. For instance, when you hear somebody like Tucker Carlson spend a lot of airtime talking about the Great Replacement theory and this conspiratorial allegation that there's some sort of top-down structured way to slowly replace the demographics of the United States to increase the presence of non-whites and decrease the presence of whites, well, that's predicated on a kind of pseudoscientific view of race essentialism and race biologization, which the fields of genetics and biology and developmental biology just don't support. So you have this interconnected way in which different kinds of misinformation have to sort of build and support each other. You have pseudoscience that supports conspiracy claims, and you have conspiracy claims that foster further political misinformation. And all of this sort of gets interwoven in people's minds so that you can't really look at people's weird beliefs as just weird beliefs in absentia. They are embedded in a large sort of cognitive context in people's minds. So for me, slowly realizing that over the past 8 or so years has been incredibly informative for how I conduct my research and the kinds of research questions I ask. So I don't know how much more you'd like me
No,
to
we'll
say.
just start the question asking from the panel here,
Okay.
and I'll start it with this one. With the advent of social media access, how much does, I mean, we hear it called an echo chamber, but if you're arguing that conspiracy theories become embedded in one's identity cognition, in a sense, they're part of the structure, then what social media provides is just this positive reinforcement, sustaining loop that keeps their identities actually intact and keeps them feeling good about themselves. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think social media invented this or brought it to the forefront, but it certainly magnified these effects. People have always had the options of how to choose which information sources they engage with. But social media and the internet more generally has made that a lot easier and a lot more niche. Like you can just find your exact niche, whether that's a particular website or a particular community on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, whatever. So social media is certainly amplifying it. And there is some interesting research to suggest that it's not one particular group that's forming echo chambers. It's that for certain kinds of information, or I should say misinformation, everybody's sort of engaging with it in their own echo chamber. So you can engage with any sort of disinformation or misinformation claim in a number of ways. You could be trying to promote it and get the information to spread. You could be trying to debunk the information. You could be doing mockery or satire or making fun of the idea and its absurdity or not absurdity, or the absurdity of the people who believe in the disinformation. And these communities seem to just be validating their pre-existing beliefs, and there's no communication with other communities who may be feeling differently, who may be thinking differently about it. So everybody seems to be engaging a little bit in some echo chambery stuff when the claim or the belief in question serves more of a social identity purpose rather than like helping somebody successfully navigate the world. A lot of conspiracy theory beliefs, for instance, don't give you any guidance on how to act.
Right.
But a lot of other kinds of misinformation claims do. If we look at the COVID-19 pandemic, for instance, there was a lot of misinformation that was health oriented. If you do this, you'll prevent yourself from getting COVID, or if you do this, it'll protect you if you get symptoms. If you get sick, it'll lessen the symptoms. That just turned out not to be true. But that information tended to spread more widely across communities because that was misinformation that was still of a nature that gave you an idea of something to do. Whereas the COVID conspiracy theories, by contrast, and a lot of other conspiracy theories, they tend to stay within their own communities. There's not a lot of crosstalk because it's identity management. It's not doing something with the information or misinformation. So social media has certainly amplified the spread of both kinds of misinformation, conspiratorial and not conspiratorial, but in different ways because each of these beliefs are doing different work for us. They sort of exist to do different cognitive work for us.
So Emilio, if I could ask a question, I think that what you're talking about is just absolutely fascinating. And from a communication perspective, I mean, we're spending a lot of time too thinking about the spread of misinformation and what we can do to combat it, prevent it, ameliorate the effects of it. What are you finding there in terms of works and what doesn't work in correcting misinformation?
Oh God, that's the $64,000 question, or I guess these days the $2.04 billion question for anybody who's playing the Powerball.
That's a big one, so.
Yeah. So I think there's a danger when people talk about how to correct it in being reductionistic about solutions. There are billions of people on this planet who are motivated in countless ways to come to the beliefs that they do have, whether that's they grew up with these beliefs or they encountered them and were interested in them, or they converted from one belief system to another for various sets of reasons. So I don't think in terms of combating misinformation, we're going to find a single even really good idea. We need to be coming at this from a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different strategies that each sort of chip away at the sort of structural production of misinformation, if I could be a little weirdly poetic there. Because kind of like what Scott was saying a moment ago, activists' job isn't to convince somebody in that moment. It's to help plant a seed so that future person may change their mind. I think a similar kind of approach could work for combating misinformation. We shouldn't be looking for a single solution or a small set of solutions that gets people to just admit they were wrong and change their mind, but come up with all sorts of techniques and solutions that are across all different levels, individual level solutions, system changing solutions. These kinds of things may work. There has been some research to suggest that there's not just bottom-up approaches that work, like personal debunking of information from a trusted source or a trusted loved one, but also top-down efforts may help stem the tide of misinformation. There was some research by Professor Gordon Pennycook and his colleagues that suggested that on social media sites, if you just put in a little bit of like an accuracy nudge before people post or share or retweet, that engages people in such a way to think about whether what they're sharing is accurate enough to warrant sharing. And that can stem some of the misinformation flow across populations. These are not terribly huge effect sizes, but we shouldn't expect them to be because, well, not everybody comes to the beliefs they do for one reason. It's usually for a host of reasons. And if you slowly chip away at the misinformation ecology, with a bunch of different strategies, some of which work bottom up, some of which work top down, you will hopefully see long-term gains in people's information literacy and media literacy and science literacy and so on. But we need to be a little bit more active in trying to address misinformation than I think we as a culture have been.
Yeah, that kind of ties into my question for you, Emilio. I guess one of my concerns here is that sometimes I think there's an immediate danger to misinformation for people. And so I understand the whole idea, the concept of, kind of chipping away at it maybe and, locating those strategies. But when misinformation puts a group of people or a person in immediate danger of going back to this notion of violence, right, of political violence, I wonder if you could speak to what then might be a strategy or preventative measure for that, because a lot of this misinformation, and again, I appreciate what you're saying and how you're talking about it, but a lot of times that misinformation, puts certain lives into a lot of danger, right? And so, I guess I'm always concerned about the urgency in which we take these things. I don't think that it seems like we're not in like an urgent community anymore when it comes to this, especially when it is putting people's lives in danger. So I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Is different kinds of misinformation do have different sort of immediate consequences versus distal consequences. And when the consequences are potentially very immediate and people's lives are immediately threatened, there is a greater urgency to want to interfere with the flow of misinformation across a network. Again, sort of going back to COVID-19 misinformation, when there were claims of miracle cures like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine and so on, it became really important for all of the relevant expert communities across medical research and so on to intervene and say, no, this is bad. This is not accurate information. These are useful medications for certain situations. COVID is not one of them. And given misinformation that leads to political violence or hate crimes, there's a similar sense of urgency that needs to be had to intervene on behalf of the potential victims of that violence. When we see the rise in anti-trans rhetoric, for instance, that itself is rhetorically identical to anti-Jewish rhetoric in Nazi Germany, the accusation that this marginalized community is targeting children for sexualization, is pulled straight from the Nazi playbook that was anti-Semitic in origin. It becomes very important for everyone involved who cares about the integrity of information to step up to the plate and address this and say, this is messed up, this is misinformation, this is dangerous in so many ways, in addition to just being plain wrong. And I feel that in those instances, we as members of very highly regarded epistemic communities in academic cultures, we have really dropped the ball on this a lot. And it is something that we should perhaps be a little embarrassed about, and use that embarrassment to motivate ourselves to be a little bit more willing to engage with the public, with politics, with each other, to really convey more accurate and more epistemically justified information, rather than just hoping that the absurdity of the claims that are anti-trans or anti-Black or anti-immigrant will somehow be magically disbelieved by people. People can believe absurd things very easily. If you don't step in to correct it, there's a problem. So yeah, when there's an immediate need to correct it because people could be put at risk, yeah, we do need to step up more quickly than we have ever bothered to step up before.
Well, Emilio, I have a follow-up to that. So I think that I totally agree that those of us who kind of are in the kind of epistemic communities that we embody on a university campus have a responsibility. I think, though, what troubles me, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on this, is that we can only do so much, right? I mean, I think for me, the question is about who is managing the infrastructure, right, for the dissemination of this. And I'm thinking, of course, about, Twitter and the current kind of ownership of Twitter. Thinking about Facebook and the I don't even know what word to use for Facebook at this point. Abdication of responsibility, and also the fact that, and I think this kind of comes back to the midterm elections, right? We have not seen any progress on legislation for dealing with social media. We have part of the polarization is driven by certain arguments about the state of free speech on these platforms. And I do think that the question that I have is what do you think we need to do as a public, as a culture? I mean, clearly you can also think about our profession and the context of this question, but if those who are clearly creating an infrastructure that incentivizes this kind of behavior and the dissemination of these conspiracy theories, and if those who own the platforms or manage them are not willing to do anything to curb the spread of that, then what recourse do we have if they're not willing to do anything, and if Capitol Hill's not going to do anything? Like, what would you say?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I don't necessarily agree with whoever it was that called Twitter the new public forum or public square, town square. I think that might have actually been Elon Musk who said that, but I could be mistaken.
Oh,
but I don't really.
He has said that.
Yeah, but I don't know if that's really true necessarily, because that is a vastly and globally interconnected platform, but people still exist in different contexts. They exist locally within their community. And so if the platform, this vastly globally interconnected platform, is not willing to step up to the plate and curb misinformation unless or until it becomes sort of profitable for them to do so, or they are required to by various government and regulatory agencies, well, then don't look to those platforms necessarily as how you get out there and engage with the community. You can still get involved locally in your area. You can do public outreach that may not get a big audience on Twitter or YouTube or Twitch or TikTok or anything, but you can still get involved locally. And I think there's actually some advantages to doing that and working at that smaller scale of analysis, is that members of your community who don't normally interact with the academy will start to interact with members of the academy and start to be a little bit more open to viewing academics and educators as part of their own community. And you build interpersonal trust at a very intimate level that way, rather than trying to just position yourself as a position we're all very familiar with, of being the expert in the room at the front of class or the front of the convention center behind the lectern, presenting to an audience who is already disposed to at least take you somewhat seriously to begin with. You're not going to find that on Twitter or YouTube or anything like that necessarily. You have to build that up over time in spite of the platform's predilections to finding misinformation more engaging and more profitable. But you can still work locally. You can still get involved in your community. Start a science cafe at the local coffee shop. Do little things like that that put yourself out of the ivory tower, out of the halls of academia, and in with where people are, and not just people who can afford the time to pay attention to academics. If you're willing to reach out to where people are in the community, you can have a positive impact as well, by being seen as a member of their in-group, and therefore as a more trusted member who also has this background of being an expert in whatever you're an expert in: economics, communications, psychology, whatever. And that gives you a lot of buy-in and clout to work at a lower level, to combat misinformation, but one that is still effective.
So, bringing all these conversations together, you have different nested scales of influence, right? You've got interpersonal interaction, which has its own time scale and its own impact on how do I change my behavior as a function of interacting with this other person. But then you got the speed of social media, which is vastly faster, not nearly as nuanced. And I think the tensions that Byron mentioned are very real. In other words, if people are saying things like, "How's Nancy Pelosi?" Right? Wink, wink. That cuts through a time scale into individual actions in a way my sitting around empathizing with someone on a one-to-one level can't compete with. And so what I'm trying to get at is, why is it so difficult for a current contemporary American culture for the public works to manage its own communication infrastructure? I.e., are we so committed to privatization that we believe someone should own Twitter? Someone should own Facebook? I mean, there was a time when those were made part of the public works. And so when we're talking about timescales and management of and how quickly hate can make its way through a system, I'm just curious how your work would intersect with the idea of, good old-fashioned public works and managing as a public how we communicate.
Oh God, I almost want to say that answering that question is above my pay grade, but I'll give it a go.
Asking the question was above my pay grade.
Fair enough. No, it's a fantastic question. But this, I think, because part of the reason I say that is because I imagine answering your question moves a little bit outside of psychology and cognitive science, which are my background, and more into political science and economics, or at the very least, the intersection of all of these fields. And I'm hesitant to put on display my vast ignorance of economics and political science in answering this. But yeah, there's certainly something to be said about having a political system, a socio-political system that values the individual above the collective, which I think is something that is in enough of American culture that we get these kinds of outcomes where there is no collective, that is to say governmental or publicly owned oversight of these massive companies that serve as de facto public utilities or public services, at least for telecommunications purposes. And this is partially a consequence of these very same platforms and systems that do seek to encourage more and more thinking individualistically and thinking, not so much of yourself embedded in a cultural context, but as a person who is performing on screen as the center of attention, or at least the potential center of attention. And if these are the incentive structures that are presented by these large tech telecom platforms like Twitter and YouTube and so on, well, of course, people's psychology is going to accommodate that in order to try to successfully navigate it. How do I make sure to not be Twitter's main character of the day, but still be able to perform my individuality in the way that the platform expects, and people are having to manage and negotiate that. I may have sidestepped your question a little bit
No,
there.
that was a beautiful answer because it's the oxymoronic nature of how to express my individuality in a social context. Right?
Yeah,
Right.
it's one of those things where a certain amount of thinking individualistically is very adaptive and very beneficial, but we are, no person is an island. We are embedded in a larger, in multiple larger sociocultural contexts and communicative contexts and interpersonal contexts, and we might need to work on fostering more of that kind of thinking. Earlier, you members of the panel were talking about dehumanization and various kinds of dehumanization. And I kept thinking about some work on people viewing humanity as a part of nature versus a part from nature.
Yep.
And that sort of broad cultural ideological worldview where you can call somebody an animal and it is dehumanizing and that creates an empathy gap, but it's a little bit less effective if you're coming at this from an ideological viewpoint that views humanity as a part of nature, because, well, then non-human animals are also deserving of empathy and concern and moral patiency as well. But if you view humanity as a part from nature, particularly in a hierarchical and superordinate position, well, then, yeah, dehumanization of somebody by calling them an animal or calling them vermin or calling them, something is much more effective because you're now exacerbating that empathy gap. So if we move away from this sort of toxic individualism and a little bit more towards viewing ourselves as part of a social collective and as part of a context and an ecological context as well, that might help move us in a direction where we may want a little bit more communal oversight of these massive platforms. But that is certainly a long-term project that you got to start planting the seeds of now to reap the benefits way down the line.
Well, I think the group here would admit that that question was not above your pay scale. That was an amazing answer. And planting the seeds is exactly what we're doing here. So, Amelia, we thank you so much for joining us this evening, and we wish you all the best in your future endeavors.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Amelia.
Thank you.
Keep forgetting I don't have to put my headphones on now. So we got a couple minutes before we have to meet with other people. I thought that was a great conversation, guys.
Mm-hmm.
Comments, reactions while we got a few minutes?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm still kind of processing everything because I think that, if the problem is this kind of toxic individuality, I guess the question is, how do you create a new subject, or how does a new subject emerge?
Well said.
That's not toxic, right?
Right.
For lack of Western, society, we privilege the individual, but the individual does become part of kind of larger mob mentalities.
Yes.
And so I think I think when we think about that toxic individuality, I think on the one hand you can think about the kind of neoliberal subject that is encouraged to just see itself as a bundle of skills and hyper self-interested and hyper isolated, and have no concern for society or community, right? Margaret Thatcher said, right, there is no such thing as society. On the other hand, you have a sense of the individual that then willingly wants to become part of a larger kind of collective mob mentality, because there's a certain incentive or there's a certain kind of fulfillment in being part of a larger group. Do you know what I mean? And I think that's what the conspiracy theory gives you.
Yes.
Right. That's the kind of like mana, if you will, for the psyche. And so I think I think what our conversation prompts me to think about is, there's generally when we think about individualism, we think about it in a very kind of neoliberal way. I think we have to maybe think about complicating that and thinking about how maybe some older kind of critiques of mass society are still with us, right? And how like the individual gets lost in a mass, kind of melts into a mass, and that's part of the problem as well. So
No, I love it.
Hey, you guys have time for another YouTube question?
We do.
All right, we've got Nicholas out there. He says, I'm curious about your thoughts on the increasingly nationalized advertising in political races. Ads against candidates focusing entirely on, again, like Nancy Pelosi, for example, and being outside of their local races. I don't know if that plays into anything that you just mentioned as well, but
Well, no, I think it does.
Mhm.
I think
Agreed.
it does a lot, because I think when you're looking at a lot of this political violence, it's motivating people from different parts of the country to then go somewhere else to commit violence, and that's what you saw in
Yeah.
Buffalo. And I think that Emilia's points about recognizing what you can do locally are vitally important. At the same time, though, there is a certain kind of post-geographic element to this violence, right? Where people are departing where they are to go somewhere else to commit violence in the name of
Mhm.
some kind of like larger cause or mob mentality or conspiracy theory that they adhere to, and they get some kind of psychological fulfillment from. And so I think that, yeah, I mean, the nationalization of our politics contributes to it. At the same time, though, the fact is, because of gerrymandering, because of the kind of because there are certain states that, because there are only so many, I mean, really because of the Electoral College, right? Not just the Electoral College, but also the balance of power within the Senate and the House. There's only so many citizens in the United States that actually have a kind of true civic agency to shift the direction of who assumes power
Yep.
within Washington. And because of that, it raises the stakes, it raises the intensity, and it also kind of heightens the animus, so to speak, right? And so, I mean, that's I think that's why. I think that, to me, that's kind of how they tie together.
Yeah, I think that in a simple sort of way, keeping the politics national keeps the story simple, and it keeps it the same within the party, and it allows people to gain social reward as part of a group by pressing buttons in front of a computer, instead of going out and engaging people locally where the issue is much more complicated and nuanced. So these social media interactions actually afford identity sustainment in ways that you could not get 30 years ago. Unless you went down to the VFW, unless you went to that club, then you were around people who could bolster your identity by saying the same things together. Now you can sit in your basement and you can feel connected to millions of people and use that to drive across the country and torment people. So I do think that it's keeping the story simple, and then keep giving people a way to keep their identity stable through hate with a simple story. Yeah.
We're still waiting for our colleagues from Heartland Community College to join via Zoom.
We should take a 5-minute break.
Yeah, so why don't we do that? Why don't we take a 5-minute break at this point, and we'll get them connected, and we'll continue. So give everybody a chance to stretch a little bit.
Very cool.
Great conversation. We'll be back in 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Okay, we're back, everybody. Thank you again for tuning in to Election Night Live, where we're talking about a lot of issues related to the 2022 midterm elections. And at this point, we're really happy and thrilled to be joined by some colleagues of ours at Heartland Community College, and they're doing an election watch party. Yeah,
right.
Election watch party at Heartland. And while we've been talking since the last guest we had on, there was an announcement in the Illinois governor's race, right? So the announcement was that Pritzker won that. So that's interesting. So for our colleagues at Heartland, we've had a long relationship between ISU and Heartland in terms of civic engagement work. So it's really great to have you join us. So tell us a little bit about what you all are seeing tonight.
Hi, so we are just doing an election night watch party. So we have students and staff, and like their families, and we're just having a social event.
What are the big takeaways from the kinds of things that you've seen or talked about tonight so far? What's the student perspective on all of this?
Well, the student perspective was, we're all pretty, I mean, some of the races we saw it coming, but we've been watching NBC Chicago, and it's just interesting to see how all the races are coming out.
Has there been anything surprising to you yet at this point?
Georgia? Yeah, Georgia was really surprising. Very surprising. The governor race in Georgia.
Okay. Yeah.
Senator race.
They got it wrong.
Interesting. Okay, so what we talked about a little bit about as a panel when we got going tonight, that there was kind of a mix here between excitement and trepidation and anxiety about the events today. How are you all feeling about this election?
Nervous. Yeah, I think it's definitely nerve-wracking because there is a lot at stake here, but it's just so close everywhere that I think it's really time to just shut up and pay attention and see what happens.
I would describe it as a cautious dread.
Okay. And that'd be a sweet name for a band too, by the way, Cautious Dread, just saying. What are some of the big issues that you all are really focused on?
I think really just engaging people in political science and just kind of trying to help educate students.
Okay, so that's a great thing to think about. Hopefully we have students at other campuses across the country that are tuned in tonight and kind of watching. So kind of as a last minute thing, what would be your message to them about the need for your age group to be civically engaged right now?
Well, I think if you think about it, we are the youth, and so we are the future of this country, and the sooner that we get politically involved, the more we understand how this works and the more we can make this country work for us. And we can see what we want happen in the world. Exactly, we're shaping our future. Yeah.
Absolutely, and that's a great message for us to end on. Thank you all so much at Heartland Community College for taking some time to join us tonight. Enjoy the rest of the evening. Go Hawks! And thank you again. Okay, so I think we're ready for, or close to ready for, another guest speaker at this point.
There you go.
They need to mute themselves.
Okay. Byron.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's all good. It's all good.
So now we're going to turn the conversation over to this wonderful, wonderful person who I just absolutely adore. So, Dr. Hims, we're going to ask you to introduce yourself to the audience and then invite you to discuss your work on minority identity development and hope in this contemporary democracy. And once again, I'm just so happy to see you once again looking like a fly.
Thank you. I can't really see you, but I'm happy to see you too. So hello everyone. My name is Vanessa Hintz. I am a licensed clinical psychologist and a diversity, equity, and inclusion professional. And I have 4 accounts, so forgive me if I keep looking over here. I'm currently located just west of Milwaukee in Wisconsin. So we're one of those swing states, and we have 2 pretty important races that we're watching, the Senate race and also the governor's race. So that's why I keep, because our polls just closed. So thank you again for the opportunity to speak with you all in this late hour, and thank you for accepting me as I am. This is my nighttime look, so thank you for accepting me as I am. But I can talk a little bit about sort of racial identity development, particularly for people of color, and how I think that pretty much forever, but particularly of late, there has been some politicizing of racial identity and sort of issues related to racial justice. So if that's cool, I can just sort of
course.
all right, I'll just rip on that and then we'll see what happens. So ostensibly in the United States, for people of color, the process of coming into one's own racial identity, there's a lot of different models that we have, models that are specific to specific racial identities, Black racial identity, Latinx racial identity. There's a lot of different models, right? Typically, though, there is a sort of general type of movement that we see, for lack of a better word, whereas first people sort of are aligned with majority values. So people in America align with American values, which typically means white, Eurocentric, individualistic type of values. And they sort of are just going with the flow. Like that's what we see all the time, every day. That's what we're inundated with. So people of color, and let me just also preface this by saying everybody doesn't have to experience this. People can sort of come to their identity in their own way. This is just but one way to understand identity development. But essentially, at the outset, again, people are kind of just going with the flow. Like I'm just like everybody else. Like we're all just cool, like living together, And then undoubtedly, for people of color, something happens, something that we would identify as like a race-related event that reminds them that you are not treated the same as white people. For instance, for a lot of people, for particularly a lot of young people, the murder of George Floyd was one such incident where people were sort of bombarded with and inundated with this race-related violence, is what I would call it. And there was this sort of large-scale reckoning that people of color are not treated the same way as white people. So when people experience that type of race-related event, it pushes them into what we call a state of dissonance, where they kind of are questioning their firmly held beliefs that they had before, like, oh, everybody in America is treated exactly the same. Absolutely not. And so people, again, are sort of confronted with that, and then they move into a space of dissonance, which ultimately leads people to a space that sometimes we call resistance and immersion, where essentially people, I don't want to be around anybody unless they look like me. I don't want to be around no white people. I only want to be around other people of color. And I really only want to be around other people of color that look like me or who identify like I do. And undoubtedly what happens is people are into that space and something else happens where those beliefs, those firmly held sort of unbalanced beliefs are called into question. Typically, a white person is cool, and then people get confused, like, oh my gosh, like this white person is cool. What do I do? And ultimately, what we see is people get to a more balanced state of racial identity, where it's kind of like it's a both-anding. Like I can both accept that there's an equity in the world and that it's not like every white person is not terrible. And so I think that people, I think around times like this, where for a lot of people of color, their very livelihood is on the ballot. I think that around these times, around election time and around time where people really show you who they are and what they believe, we can have a lot of those events, experiences, engagements with folks that push us into a space of dissonance. Like, oh, like we were cool, and now you just said this thing that you support this person that said this thing that's very demeaning to me, so now I don't know what to do. So that was like a long rambling on, and I hope that was helpful.
No, it was perfect.
But that's definitely where I'm at with it this evening.
I'm just going to quickly comment on your use of the, by the way, hello, Vanessa, so great to see you. Your use of the concept dissonance, right? Because it's, most of us, when we feel like we know who we are, we take it for granted that our world is stable. It just feels like it's supposed to be that way. And the world disturbs us, or our hormones disturb us, or something disturbs us, and we get into this state of surprise, which does create dissonance. And interestingly enough, we don't find ourselves coached on dissonance being a sign of potential growth. It's almost as if we experience dissonance as something to avoid. And it stuns me, okay, how we just don't talk about these things as signs of growth. Growth meaning transformation, becoming more complex, becoming more sophisticated. What would be your response to something like that?
I would say one thing that a concept that we often use in schools with students, in therapy, is this concept of growth versus fixed mindset. So a fixed mindset is exactly what you're describing, like it is what it is, and that's what it's going to be. And if for some reason there's deviation, like, whoa, that's too much for me. Versus a growth mindset is again kind of what you described, in terms of understanding that new information is opportunity for us to, again, and I don't want to say growth as like it has a value to it, just to change.
Exactly.
And I think that one thing that I have sort of come to understand in my professional career around identity, I think that we have been socialized that like you are who you are and that's it. Like you have this stable, very firm sense of who you are. And so anytime there is dissonance, like information that comes that shakes that a little bit, people get very uncomfortable because we have been socialized like you are who you are and that's it. You got to be firm in who you are.
You got to know it, absolutely.
Exactly. Yes, and we also understand that we can take in information and make decisions based on that information in the moment and who we are in the moment. Because who I am right now is maybe not who I was 6 months ago. And that doesn't mean that there's something wrong with me. That just means I am a person who is changing because change is constant. And I'm trying to go, you know what I'm saying? Absolutely.
Anyone else? Questions, comments?
Well, Doc, I gotta ask you a question here. So something that's just been on my mind since, the beginning of this election moment. So I appreciate what you're saying. And, of course, I admire the work you're doing. Here's my question. And no one at the table take offense, because I'm about to talk about y'all for a second. And I think even we can, maybe even approach this in the area of psychology, right? So one of the things that I've been really concerned about all of this, and I've come to this thinking, and I want you to diagnose me for a minute. I've come to this thinking of, all these things going on. And then I disconnect a little bit and I think, well, you know what? I didn't create this. We weren't at the table when all this stuff happened, right? And sometimes I just want to leave it to them to deal with. Once again, I don't mean to offend y'all, present company, etc. Right? But and so I wonder if you could speak to that when you think about Black folks specifically, right? And how we're dealing in this election time. And you made a good point about when things come up, like when George Floyd was murdered, right? When Ahmaud Arbery was murdered. These things just kind of affect us in this way that makes us think about, well, I mean, what do I care about this? The system's it's not going to work for me. It's not made for me. But I'm kind of at this point now where I'm thinking about through this election, why do I care about it? Because this is not something I created, right? I wasn't at the table when all this was created, and I don't want to have to fix this mess that I had nothing to do with, right? I know it sounds really cynical, right? Cynical and dark, but I think there's a lot of people who are now starting to talk about this, right? This not being at the table when these things started, when the institutions started, right? Or at least not giving credit for anything in science, as an example. So, how do we deal with this? And I wonder if you can kind of like maybe think about this, because you're in Wisconsin, right? And there's a lot, like you said, there's a lot on the line right now there, right? Because we know if certain people get elected, there's a danger for us, right?
Mhm.
There's this enhanced danger for us now, right? So how do we reconcile that?
Mhm.
I know it's a
Mhm.
big question, but
Mhm. And I'm actually going to borrow from the great Dr. Scott Jordan and say, while we may not have had a hand in creating it, what are we doing or not doing that's maintaining it? And so I think that there definitely, one thing that I would say, particularly to people who are feeling particularly hopeless and cynical, is we didn't create it. There is a large responsibility on the people in power to fix it. And oftentimes people who are marginalized don't have no power, right? I understand that. And I will also say that we do have power over certain things. So I think that there are definitely things within our sphere of control that we can do that doesn't involve absolving the entire responsibility of fixing everything, because we just can't do that. If people of color could fix racism, do you think we would still be dealing with it? Absolutely not. And so I think that it's a both and. It's a both recognizing y'all need to come and get your people and get this together. Like it's a both and also there are things within my sphere of control like voting. I can vote, right? And voting may not fix the entire thing. It's absolutely something that I can do, right? And so I think that the other thing I'll sort of say just as a caveat is wherever people are it's okay to be there. If you feel like, forget this mess, I don't care about none of this, it's okay to be there too. Like wherever you are in this moment, it's okay to be there and it's okay to feel like that because that's what is true for you in this moment. And that doesn't have to be your forever moment. And so I think that while again, like I think it's a both and. We can both acknowledge that I didn't do this, I don't have the power to fix this, and acknowledge, but I do have the power to do all these other things. And what in my behavior, what in my way of being is maintaining the inequity as it exists. So I think particularly for people of color, there are things that we can empower ourselves to do that again are not going to fix the entire system because we didn't break it and it's not our responsibility to fix it, and it's going to maybe create enough agitation and disruption that the system is not maintained. If that makes sense.
I say Dr. Hits for president. Make that sorority proud, girl. Come on.
Yes, I could never be a politician. As soon as they run a smear ad on me, I'll be ready to fight somebody. So that couldn't be me.
Well, maybe that's what's need. Maybe that needs to happen.
Well, I mean, Wisconsin's so gerrymandered, I don't know where you would run, right? So I'm a fellow Wisconsinite as well. I grew up in Madison, so
Oh, okay.
nice to see you. You were talking, so I don't know if we've met. My name is Dr. Steve Rocco. I'm at the School of Comm here at ISU. And so you were talking about this tension between growth and fixed mindsets. And I'm curious if you could comment on your general thoughts over the last 2 years, right? So obviously in 2020, right, we as collectively, we thought the country was going into a kind of a state of reckoning, right? And maybe it was a reckoning, but I think it was sort of I think when we use that word reckoning, we're kind of trying to theorize or trying to name an opening, right? An opportunity for growth, right? On a kind of deeper kind of awareness of the structural racism that has been foundational to the United States and that has been maintained through generations. And that it was sort of an impasse, right? Or I should say, it seemed like there was a moment of opportunity, right? But then 2021 comes around, and we begin to see that, a lot of the concepts of critical discourse analysis, a lot of the concepts like critical race theory, a lot of the concepts for trying to diagnose this very structural impasse that has been sort of foundational to America, all of a sudden becomes weaponized, right?
Yes.
It becomes sort of a dirty word. Right, you have all these people running away from this term, even though they don't even know what the term is. And of course, we don't have a culture that's kind of talking about what these terminologies mean in any kind of nuanced sense, right? I mean, that doesn't really fit into a 30-second soundbite very well, unless you're using it as kind of an attack term, right? And it seems like we've been,
you know, earlier we talked about sort of our feelings about where things are in the United States and kind of the deep anxiety. I think there seems to be this tension between are we at a growth moment or are we at a reassertion of the fixed mindset on race relations? I'm just kind of curious how you see the relationship between this kind of growth mindset or the opportunities for it, or kind of the kind of the I don't know the reestablishment of a fixed mindset, right? And maybe the backlash to 2020, all in the span of the last 2 years. I'm just curious what you think about that kind of as we're moving forward.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because the first thing, like a psychologist, the first question I have is who is we? Like when you talk about we and us and America moving forward, like who are we talking about? Because I definitely feel like there are different versions of America for different people, right? And so it's very hard for me to think about like what is America's collective mindset, because I feel like it is just almost impossible to answer that question. But what I was thinking about as you were sort of talking is what I think we sort of have to correlate with growth versus fixed mindset is we cannot remove discussions of power. So I feel like people are okay with being fixed when that means my power stays the same. People want to change and move and do all this other stuff. And what are you talking about critical race theory? When they feel that their power is somehow going to be shifted. So critical race theory, I think, is a great example. People don't want their kids to learn about race because they don't want their kids to be uncomfortable, which to me is really, I don't want there to be any shift in the power dynamic. My kids' comfort is paramount. Yep. I don't want there to be any shift in that dynamic. And so I think that, again, growth versus fixed mindset, I think, again, people are ready to talk about growth and change, if it means we can maintain the power the way that it is, versus no, America's fine. Let's keep it the way, let's return to these values, all that stuff. That sort of fixed way of thinking, to me, the correlation here is with power. Like I want my power. People with power want it to stay that way, right? And so I think over the past 2 years, all of this sort of vitriol, and I would even go back further to 2016 when all of this mess started for real. I think that what we are seeing is a fear-based reaction to power shifting. What we saw on January 6th was an absolute tantrum, fear-based tantrum that was horrendous, because people felt like their power was being taken away. And the thing that I think we also have to remember about power is people always view it as a pie. Like, if you have some, then that means I have less. Like, no, you know what I'm saying? Like, we can try to balance power without it having to be like that. You know what I'm saying? So I do think over the past 2 years, the sort of undercurrent of a lot of this, like I said, sort of really this intensity has been around what people experience as shifts in power.
So I agree with everything you just said, and I'm gonna say, let's go back at least 50 years, right, to the reorganization of power even in the white world. In the white world 50 years ago, you had unions that had power, and the middle class made 80 grand a year out of high school. That does not exist. But that power was torn away from the middle class whites by the white elites. I mean, and they blamed it on women and minorities, and this is where we are now, right? Mm-hmm. So I appreciated your description about power, and I think at least for the last 50 years, we can see that if you just look at where the percentage of American wealth exists right now, you understand where power has been taken to, and in terms of empathy and getting the disenfranchised to come to the table instead of joining dehumanizing hate groups. How do I say this? They have to be heard, but they have to hear what happened. And it wasn't whites, it was not women and minorities that took away their middle class life. It was wealthy whites. And until we have that conversation, I don't think we're really going to be able to change the narrative we're living in. because we have to pay attention to what's going on for the last 50 years in that world. So I don't know if
I
there
feel
was
like,
a question
yeah, I
or
feel
not,
like we
but
could go back further. We could go back further because Michelle Alexander in the new Jim Crow, that this started with the when enslaved peoples were freed, and the wealthy plantation owners said, "You better watch out. Them freed Black people and these Native Americans, they're gonna take all your stuff." So this started way back when there was the 1% of back then told, again, white people with lower socioeconomic status, like, hey, watch out for those people over there.
Yeah.
And because the roots of racism run so deep in America, it was easy for people to believe that, like, that this person who literally does not have a last name and nothing to their name is not the threat to you. But because, again, that we have been inundated with supremacist ideals, white supremacist ideals, it is easy for people to believe that. And again, I think you're absolutely right. Until we have that conversation, which I think we're like not even almost ready to have that conversation. I think we're going to continue. It's unfortunate because I think that we're actually getting further and further away from being able to have that conversation because of the way that things are happening now, and because, again, it's becoming politicized to have conversations like that. Like, we can't even bring that up because we don't want people to be uncomfortable. Since when has discomfort been something to be feared? Like, everything, my daddy told me all the time, if anything worth having, it's worth, like, you got to work hard for that. It's going to be uncomfortable. But we have gotten into this space where, like, no discomfort whatsoever, but only for a certain select few. You know what I'm saying? There are certain people's comfort who's prioritized. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and just a quick comment to respond. For me, this election is partly about our cultural willingness to have that conversation, right? And the election goes one way, maybe the election goes another way, it becomes harder. And for me, that's all tied up in the things I talked about dehumanization, formation of strong in-groups that have robust out-group hate, all in the name of generating identity stability. I'll shut up, I've said this before, but this is psychologically deep, psychologically rich, and if we can't do a little therapy on ourselves as a culture, things, well, I'll stop there.
I want to just jump in real quick. So, I'll kind of direct this to you, Doc. But I think I'll direct it to you also.
Sure.
Doc. So, I guess, I think about, Heather McGee's project, right? The Sum of Us, right? Where she talks about this notion of public goods, right? And how those public goods. So, for example, she has a chapter in there called Draining the Pool, right? And that Draining the Pool chapter is about, and this kind of goes to this idea of having this conversation. In that chapter, she talks about, that rather than allowing Black folk in the swimming pools, right, which my father was a part of that generation, right, they would drain the pool and close it instead, right? And so it just makes me wonder when we talk about having this conversation. I mean, part of me is thinking, well, we continue to have this conversation, right? So you wonder, how do you make this, having the conversation look different? Maybe that's the thing I'm trying to think about. Do you have to make the conversation look different? But then I wonder about, well, damn, darn, here we go, we have to make the conversation look different for people again, right, who have not wanted to have this conversation. But even beyond my own cynical thoughts with that, I mean, how would that look different to bring people to want to have that conversation? So, like you said, Dr. Hens, is this notion of thinking about, well, CRT is going to make my children feel really bad, right? When we know this is part of our history. So I don't know, what are the strategies to getting people to, and I think that's something we need to talk about, is what are the strategies that we use to bring people who rather drain the pool, because I think those people still exist, to want to have that conversation, to maybe make that change. Because I think we see this playing out in this political moment that we're in also, right? It's just going back to not wanting to have this conversation. And Jonathan Sokol, who's a historian, writes in this book, There Goes My Everything, that one of the reasons that white Southerners were so, disgusted with the civil rights movement is because what you just said, right? They feared this loss of their everything, right? This shift in power, but not just power politically, but financial power, right? Economic power. And then that's when it really gets frightening, I think, for people. This fear of, well, I don't want to share my wealth with that person who looks like that. Because again, they're not really human. Right. And so, think going back to what Amelia was talking about, how do we think about, this level of humanity, right? So I don't know. I don't know if there's something we can, address now, or it's just, I think it's important that we think about what kind of strategies do we use to, I would say, try again to have this conversation. I think I know a conversation has to work with people on both sides, but it just seems like both sides just don't want to ever have the conversation. And I think that's the danger here.
Well, I mean, I think if, and for anybody that wants to now look at the history of the United States seriously and honestly, then you're not going to have, you're not having an exchange. What you're having are people just making kind of bad faith arguments. I don't want to talk about this. Like, for all the people about cancel culture, that's like you're trying to cancel the history of the United States. You know what I mean? Right. It's like, and that's the real problem, right?
So I'm going to get in here real quick with my friend, colleague, fellow psych geek, Dr. Ince. You celebrate those stories that tell a better story. Du Bois, Lovecraft Country, HBO's Watchmen. You celebrate these narratives that show you. Instead of trying to talk and reason in the sense of, I'm going to tell you why you're wrong. I'm going to tell you why you're misinformed. This is one of the beautiful things about contemporary narrative art, is that it's showing us different ways of talking, different ways of being. And I would argue that pop culture is doing it better than anybody right now. How many public servants do we actually hear celebrating our collective togetherness? Barack Obama, Joe Biden. I find pop culture doing a better job of showing us what will get us somewhere else other than our current political conversation. So, fellow sidekick, what do you think?
Cosign, I agree. And I think that one thing that is valuable about pop culture is that it gives us a safe distance, with which to navigate those emotions and feelings. Again, like when we're, looking at Wakanda, that is a fictional place that I can feel safe navigating my feelings about, because Wakanda's not gonna knock on my door and try to come have a conversation with me. You know what I'm saying? And so I agree wholeheartedly. And I think another thing to Dr. Craig, the point that you mentioned about how do we, get people to have these conversations. I think one thing that I would say is that, like you said, conversations happen on both sides. And I think what has become very difficult is allowing people's opinions to be like validation without affirmation. And so to me, that is very difficult as a marginalized person, because so often the opinions that I need to give space to are ones that demean my very existence as a person, right? Demean my value, demean everything. And so again, I feel like we have to be able to, and this is very difficult, and again, it's when we're getting into this sort of critical discourse space. How can I allow space for us to have a conversation that, again, allows your opinion to be valid without affirming it? And by valid, I mean you're a human being and your life is just as valuable as mine. So you can say what you say. I can think it is absurd. That doesn't mean I affirm it. It means I allow space, and we're not just shouting and screaming at each other. And that, I think, is where it is very difficult, because again, historically, there have been, like, I don't want to say, I will say harmful. harmful opinions that have been elevated and have been, again, written into the very laws and nature of this country. That so I have to continue to make space for that, but there's no space made for me that I matter.
Mhm.
No space made for me that, you know what I'm saying? And so I think that that is, to go back to your point about being a marginalized person that's just like, this is some bullshit. You know what I'm saying? Like, that is how we get to that space. And so how can more people who call themselves allies make more space for there to be more for more validation of opinions that disrupt this larger narrative that sort of is permeating our country, which is the narrative of inequity. That's where I think we have to start. But I think, again, we don't be taught that. Like, we don't be taught how to do that. And so even for well-intentioned allies, that is very, very difficult. It's very difficult.
That was a mic drop.
Yeah.
Amazing.
So we have any other questions for Dr. Hintz?
So when are you gonna go see Wakanda Forever?
For the first time, probably.
Yeah.
For the second time, next weekend.
There you
For the
go.
third time, the weekend after that.
Well,
Fantastic.
you know, I do want to add one thing real quick, you know, with the discussion of pop culture, right? You know, and I, you know, of course, I love pop culture, right? You know, I love shows like The Boys and things like this, right? But there is a debate within some of the Black academic community that sometimes turning to pop culture can be traumatizing, right? And we don't want to see it, right? So I still know folks who won't watch Lovecraft Country, right? Who won't watch them, who won't watch some of these shows that might, you know, that I think we can, some people just can't separate from that, right? It's too difficult for them. And so, you know, I'm always kind of cautious about turning toward the pop culture things. I know that's going to exclude some people from that conversation who aren't going to feel comfortable, you know, watching those shows. Now, of course, you know, I'm going to watch them because I love this stuff, right? But you know, I'm just trying to think about, you know, ways to maybe, you know, kind of navigate through that, right? And kind of have that discussion with people about, you know, and I know we can't, you know, you can't get everyone, you know, you can say these things, right? But the expectation shouldn't be that you're going to change their mind, right? And in there, like we talked about earlier, right? But I see the value in those, right? But I wonder how might we talk to someone who is very leery about that, right? About, you know, watching things like this, right? So, you know, I've now seen, and I know this is different, but I've seen Till. I'm going to go back to that again. I've seen Till twice now. Okay, right. And so I know that that's going to be, and it's going to probably hurt the film in a way, right? Because people aren't going to see it. But it's also such an important part of, I think, starting to have these conversations.
Yeah.
And maybe making people feel comfortable to have these conversations. So I took a group of graduate students to see it last night for my race and trauma class, right? And one of the things we finished up when the movie was over, we talked about, you know, I talked about the fact that, you know, anti-lynching law just, you know, was passed this past March, right? Again, 67 years after his murder. And so, you know, it ties certainly into our political culture now, right, in a way. But it's just, you know, you have to, you can't help but wonder, how do we get more people to maybe think about, you know, the how these shows can be productive, right?
And-
So, and I don't know the answer to that, but, you know, and I don't know if anyone can answer it, but I think it's just something we have to think about.
And I will say, you saw the face I made when you said Till. I don't want to watch. I don't want to watch that. I don't want to watch When They See Us. And again, I don't think that I think, and this is easy. I don't want to say easy. This is the way that my mind works as a therapist, as a psychologist, right? Like, that to me is indicative of something in me that needs to be healed. And so I'm not going to demean those films. I'm not going to demean those works by saying, like, why would they make that? I'm not going to do that. I am going to do my own internal work to figure out why I want to separate myself from that. You know what I'm saying? So I think that sometimes with students or whomever, if we are trying to, utilize these as an example and people are like, no, thank you. I think, again, how do we then facilitate a space for a growth mindset around, okay, tell me a little bit about what's going on here. And again, that sounds such like a therapist thing to say, but I think even for myself, like I have been thinking about that because my husband, a white man, asked me the same thing. Do you want to go see Till? I was like, absolutely not. And really not with you, but absolutely not. Like, no, I don't want to go see that. I really don't want to go see that. And again, that is indicative of me, where I am in my sort of own like Black racial identity, where I am just in terms of how I'm coping with racial injustice. I think that we all are at a different space of how we cope with that. And so again, I think what I would charge people with who are like, no, 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 is again to try to think about how, where, why that is affecting you, so that then again, that don't mean you have to go see the movie, but how can you do your own internal work? Because we know we're faced with racial injustice every single day. And so what is it that we can do, you know what I'm saying, to really make more sense of that for ourselves in terms of how we are dealing with that? Because again, I don't want to see none of that. And that's just something that I have to sort of work through myself in terms of how do I make sense of that. You know what I'm saying?
I just think that's Brian, at the individual level, we can pay a little more attention to what shocks us, to what surprises us, because it does reveal something about us. And it does sound preachy of me if I were to say, examine that. At the same time, that's an epistemic emotion. That's an emotion that leads to approaching your own values, having a conversation and people in a safe space, like on a podcast, perhaps, is a way to be together while you're dealing with these very difficult, and then it's not so alone, it's not so personal. I'm not sure why that bothers me, why that hurts me. And I think that's an individual mechanism we can use ourselves, is to cultivate a life of surprise, leading to curiosity as opposed to fear and avoidance. And I don't mind people saying, I'm scared, I don't want to watch it. Well, what that usually turns into then is, well, it was wrong and it was bad. And I understand that cognitive conversion, because once you say it's not about me, once you say it's bad, then it's not about you. Or you're not avoiding anything, it's the world's bad. And I get I get the sanity value of saying those kind of things to oneself. But in terms of one's own openness, those are the kind of things I expect,
Well, Doc, we've kept you on here for quite a while. So, one thing I will end with is that I think what we need to do is get this like giant, real big microphone or sound system and just kind of play you around the country. I think that'd be a great thing to do. You could be doing a virtual workshop every day for 24 hours a day. I think that'd be really great. And I think that would, you say some compelling words that I think heal us and can really lead, I think, to a better us, right? So I appreciate you being here and taking some time with us. And, of course, I'm crazy about you. So can't wait till us to get on a podcast again together. So, all right. So, Dr. Hens, thank you so much for being here. And I think we're done with this witness.
Yeah.
Thanks for witnessing.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Take care.
Thank you.
So I know we're kind of running here with time, but
We should have a break.
take a 5-minute break. Okay, so there's yeah. So I think when we come back from the break, let's see if we have any maybe any really quick election updates. When
Yeah.
we come back.
Sounds great.
All right.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm Steve Hunt. We're broadcasting from the School of Communications Social Media Analytics Command Center, and we're in our third hour of election coverage, talking about themes and issues related to the 2022 midterm elections. Did get an update here locally on campus for those of you that might be interested in Illinois State University. And I love that we talk so much at the beginning about student agency and the confidence we have in this group to make a positive difference in our democracy. That over 1,600 people voted at the Bone Student Center today, that there were 30 to 45 minute lines from noon to 6 p.m., but that the students were great and the poll workers there were very complimentary of how patient the students were and all of that. So really good news, and we'll have to wait to get more information about the full turnout at ISU, but that sounds great. So, without any further ado, Dr. Jordan, if you would like to introduce our next guest speaker.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hunt. It is my extreme pleasure to introduce Dr. Leandra Paris, dear friend, amazing colleague. Dr. Paris, please tell us a little bit about what you do and how it relates to the notion of social justice and hope in school-age children.
That's a big question.
I know, it's a huge.
It is good. Yeah. So I'm a school psychologist. And so school psychologists provide a wide range of services in schools, from academic support and assessment to mental health services. And so some of us do more of the assessment side, and my expertise is on the mental health side. And so I specialize in crisis response. So I actually just got done with giving a 2-day training on crisis prevention and intervention and all of that. And we talk a lot about trauma-informed care with that, and how to help students respond to the plethora of crises that we're experiencing right now, and make sure that they're able to feel psychologically safe in school so that they can learn and thrive in that environment. And in terms of social justice, a lot of my work is centered around Vernon's equity-centered trauma-informed care. So making sure that our practices are anti-oppressive, they're asset-based, that they are universal and proactive, that they're human-centered, really focusing on human potential, and are socially just, right? And so we're providing them equitably. We're making sure students have access. We're identifying barriers to getting access to mental health in schools and doing our best to remove those barriers. And then also how people feel. So social justice is also about stigma and prejudice and discrimination. And so a lot of students I work with, that is a contributing factor to the trauma that they're experiencing. So we do a lot around peer aggression and microaggressions and things like that. So I train students to go out and do that. And then I train local school districts in those procedures as well.
So you're a superhero at multiple scales at the same time, right? And the things we see happening at the national level, we find happening in individual interactions with young kids, group interactions. So, I mean, you talk about trauma-informed care, and of course, trauma can go to despair, right? So what is it that you try to work on to keep children from sliding into despair and to cultivate a sense of hope?
That's a really good question. I think when I'm training educators and working with students, or like even doing our lesson plans with youth that we were actually directly working with, we talk a lot about trauma is burning the field. It kind of wipes away what is normal. You lose meaning. And our job as interventionists, as school psychologists, is to make sure that whatever grows back is strong and healthy as it can be. Because without the support that we provide, without hope, without social support, which is the #1 indicator, just throwing some research out there, what comes back has the potential to be stress, that post-traumatic stress reaction. And so oftentimes when I'm working with students or we're doing trainings, we talk a lot about hope in terms of an antidote to trauma. So trauma is helplessness, it's entrapment, it's powerlessness, and hope gives you an antidote, a boost to those things, right? So if I can get a child to feel hopeful, I give them something to work towards, they're more likely to benefit from any of the other services that they might be getting. So we spend a lot of time talking about radical hope, which is from French 2020, I think. And the idea being that when we heal, that process of healing requires aspirational hope, dreaming of what could be, envisioning what could be, but also not losing sight of the barrier, like for us as mental health practitioners, not losing sight of the barriers that we need to disrupt to make sure that those aspirations can become a reality. So that's, I hope, the answer to the question you were asking.
No, that was fantastic. Because it sounded like on the one hand, you're trying to cultivate a sense of hope in the kid, while for yourself, you're trying to sell them an honest bill of goods, right? You're trying to make sure that they can know that you're doing the work to help them live in an equitable space where they might be able, where the hope might actually play out. So that's really training on your part of future school psychologists, right?
Yes.
And how
Yes.
recently did that come into the field? How long has it been part of how the work gets done?
So you say that again?
How recently is that way of thinking come into the pedagogy of future school psychologists?
It's very, very recent. So I was actually introduced to it within the past couple of years by Dr. Celeste Malone, who does a lot of work in our field. And 2020s, I mean, right as the pandemic was hitting, right? And now the pandemic has provided an opportunity for us to see a lot of inequities and all of the other pandemics that we're experiencing in addition to COVID. And I think we need that hope. And it kind of came at a really good time for us to kind of say we can envision a better future while also recognizing that there's work that needs to be done. And so I liked your point about being honest with students. And one of the things I really complain about is teachers are always like, well, I don't want them to think that they can be anything that they can be, because that's not true. No, kids get to dream. Kids get to aspire. They can be, it's our job to reduce the barriers for them being what they want to be, right? And so I think that's kind of where that's come in. So it's been pretty recent. I think the field of school psychology has had a major shift since about 2017 towards adopting social justice as a strategic goal. So it's been growing for a while.
Right. Well, it sounds like therapists for a long time have been in the business of helping people. And this new move you're talking about, it's if you're saying the quiet part out loud, right? I have to change too, right? As a therapist, I have to be willing to change too, and as part of this process, instead of you being the one that might be wanting to change or needing coaching on how to change. Colleagues, you guys got any questions, comments?
Yeah, I'll start. So, Dr. Paris, this is Byron. So,
Hi.
hey there, how are you?
Good. How are
Good to
you?
see you. Good. You know, I like this idea of, you know, this kind of thinking about changing yourself also, right, as a therapist. But I wonder, in this political era that we're in right now, right, I wonder how do things like political violence, and I don't even know if that has an effect on children, right? But I wonder how you're right. So that look answered that question for me. I wonder how do you how do you engage? You know, what's the way to engage with younger children, right? And we're thinking about this, and I'm sure they're hearing that the heightened kind of narratives around politics, right? And the attack on Paul Pelosi and all this. I can imagine that probably scares them. So I wonder, how do you, what type of, what kind of training happens with people who are going to go into the school system, and then B, you know, how do you respond to school age children in this era with all these things that are going on, and helping them understand also, you know, I guess the importance of, you know, elections like midterm elections, right? But local elections also, right? Local and then the larger elections.
Yes. So the first question was around like the training. That was your question, the first part?
Yeah.
So we're told not to talk about politics. We're not supposed to bring politics up. If a child brings politics up to us, like we can kind of go there. I think a lot of the work that we're trained to do, we have handouts, we have specific lessons that we go over with our students about when there's an administrative change, like how that can be scary or how that can be really confusing for students. And so we talk a lot with caregivers about how to have those conversations. That has changed over the last couple of years. because it has become increasingly violent. And I think I noticed the biggest change in 2016 when I had practicum students who were going in to the schools and calling me crying because students were being told to go home and they were going to build a wall and they weren't going to be welcome anymore. And I realized then that we could no longer keep politics out of this conversation. And so what we're trying to do now is more about focusing on, student safety, making sure that we're having civil, I don't want to say civil discourse because that sounds like a watering down of their process, but we spend a lot of time talking about how we can teach civic engagement without getting in trouble, because it is a fine line, and not being able to like give our opinions, but also being sure that we're tucking in the idea of civic engagement and civic duty and why it's important to pay attention and to think about the impact that certain things have. And so, for example, rolling back rights for transgender youth, our students took that up here in Virginia and were like, nope, like they were marching, they were walking out, and we were just sitting quietly in the background, like, we gave you the skills to self-advocate for that, and we see you using it, right? So some of it's those skills around advocacy in general. But that's a hard one. I don't know that we do that well because we're so scared of being sued, to be honest. Like, in terms of like working with children and with the political context, it kind of, January 6th was also another big spike for us in terms of reaffirming safety. So we spent a lot of time making sure they know that they are physically safe, making sure we find ways to make them feel psychologically safe. And we have the handouts that we can kind of use because it is like a hard conversation to have, and talking about what that looks like in those communities and having those conversations as a school in terms of like, what is our role in this, right? Do we let them walk out? Absolutely. Do we join them? We can't, but we let them do what they need to do to make their voices heard. So it's difficult. I'm not going to lie. I don't think there's a good answer to your question because.
Yeah, no, but I think that was a good answer. Yeah, it helps us to see where, it kind of helps us. I think it can help us understand, once those students come to us, then maybe where they are, right? Maybe, and I think that helps explain, or helps us think about the work then that we can do once they're here, right? But also, I think it speaks beautifully to thinking about how we, yay, Westmore, sorry, how we keep, I'm sorry, Westmore is the projected winner for Maryland governor, so I'm very happy about that. But, how the, what to think about with that age group also and where they are maybe emotionally and, how they might approach politics, right, later on. And kind of seeing, I love the way you talked about, we think about immigration, right? How the kind of profound effect that could have on, that younger age group of students, right? And to think about the kind of maybe the trauma they might bring in, right? And then, for us, how that might inform their politics too later on. So, yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I think, again, like us to teach them the skills to decide for themselves has been really important as well in terms of like having that critical consciousness, thinking outside of their own bubble, being able to take perspective. And those are a lot of the social emotional skills that we're trying to push into schools because students need to have those skills for a wide range of reasons, right? But because there's political implications, now people are afraid to have them in the schools and they're trying to push back on that. So that's another thing where I'm going to go back to the hope, right? It's all about giving kids a hope and giving them the skills they need to be fully functioning human beings one day. And sometimes that means voting away their other people wouldn't want them to vote, right? So, yeah.
So, school shootings have to be something that you end up talking about, right? And gun control is right up next to that issue. So can you give us a description of K through 12 age breakdown? When do kids start to connect this violence taking place in schools with political issues like gun control? Do they not?
I'd say middle school. It
Mhm.
kind of depends on how vocal their parents are and how, I mean, they're seeing on social media. So this is another thing for me. Like, I'm technically a millennial, but like I didn't have internet till I was in college. So like I don't understand this. Like, I know everything all the time and I see everything, probably things I'm not supposed to see at a very young age.
Right.
So I would say middle school, like they're already talking about it. They're already having that awareness of how this looks, but it's primarily driven by what's being said around them, whether it's at school, in the community, and things like that. But they do start to form their own views of that, particularly as it hits closer and closer to home. I would say elementary students are still very much aware of the threat of school shootings and the outcomes of that. The drills that they have to do keep that very present in their mind. And so, and I think for us as mental health providers, we've been saying for a very long time, you know, research shows access to guns is the #1 predictor of violence during suicidal and homicidal, you know, threats at school with children. So whenever a child comes to me and is experiencing suicidal thoughts or, you know, thoughts of hurting someone, the first thing I tell parents is you have to put the guns away. Like this is the hugest red flag. It's the, if they have access to it, it increases it exponentially. And I get pushback. And I'm telling you this to protect your child. And I get they've got core beliefs around that. So it's difficult sometimes.
I can't imagine what that conversation would be like.
I mean, I would say 98% of the time the parents, you know, they want their child to be safe and they're like, yes, right. But the kids know that. The kids are very much more aware of those conversations than I think adults realize. And we hear it when they come to us. They know where the guns are,
Yeah.
whether their parents think they do or not. They know where weapons are in general in the house. They know how to get them. So that's usually my biggest like eye opener for caregivers when I give those trainings is they're like, no, they don't. And I'm like, you should go home and ask. I bet they do. You know, so again, I think it's those common sense gun laws are things that we advocate for in school psychology. We do take a huge stance with that. We have our position statement on that, and it's evidence-based, it's research-driven.
Yes, exactly.
We've had tons of data from even before Columbine around this. And so for us, it's a pretty clear-cut answer.
Anyone else have a comment or question?
So I'm kind of curious what you're seeing with social media and kids and how that's kind of contributing to this larger climate that we're living in right now with trauma and all the things we're talking about. What are some things that you observe at that early age?
Everything. So I always talk about how social media is a duality that students are actually really good at navigating and living with that I'm not. But it is a double-edged sword. So for some populations who maybe don't have access to support in their immediate family or their immediate community, social media is a wonderful source of support. They can find people like them who support their identities, who can provide that support and validate who they are, and they're good at finding those spaces. And so I never would want to take that away, right? At the same time, whenever there's a traumatic event, you know, you have these groups that are kind of popping up and they're supporting each other, but they're not doing it in a healthy way, right? And so they're sharing misinformation or they're spreading rumors, and they're kids. Like spreading rumors is kind of a middle school thing. That's what they do, but now they're doing it in a way that is much more widespread and permanent and harder to track. And so we often do a lot of digital citizenship lessons with students before anything happens, just as part of their, you know, social emotional learning around how do you have digital safe space? How do you recognize when this is a healthy thing to engage in versus when this isn't something that you want to broach? And with social media, they see a lot more that I would like for them to see. And I also recognize that's their reality and I need to meet them where they are. So that's what I try to do is find, if you're really struggling, here's this online group that I know and I've vetted and you can go there. And so some of it for me is like, we do want to reduce exposure. We do want to monitor that and also recognize that it's not going away and they're much more adept at it than we are. So we need to meet them in that space. And teach them. Like we just assume they learn this. Like who taught you how to like read a chat appropriately? Like nobody,
Right.
right? And it's something as small as that, you have to teach those skills. And so we need to start preventatively teaching those.
When you get that tweet or you see that post that is surprising, makes you feel bad.
Yeah, we have a whole lesson in our curriculum around how your body doesn't really know the difference between a tweet and a tiger. And so your body reacts to that threat the exact same way. So you need to give your body a chance to catch up and realize that it's not a real threat to you before you respond. So we talk a lot about taking time to recenter our bodies because they don't know the difference between a screen yelling at you and a tiger chasing you, right? Like it does not know that. And they get that. When you break it down to like a metaphor like that, they do understand it and they will take the time to sit back, let their brain catch up a little bit, let their body calm down, and that does wonders.
Do you actually practice that with them? You
Oh,
actually
yeah.
have them practice that? Because it's a practice thing. It's gonna, yeah, exactly. Because in the
We do a
moment, it's hard
lot.
to think yourself into chilling out, right?
Yeah, it really is. It's hard to take. We come up with like visual cues or like ways they can remind themselves, just to take that moment even before they go on to respond. And we do a lot of role play. We do a lot of narrative therapy around it to like walk through scenarios and process together. And they get it. They just need that reinforced, and they need to practice it.
You need to be coached,
They need to be.
you know, on ways to deal with it. To mention, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, which means
Something
I have to
like-
learn. I have to learn how to do that. And I have to learn how to model it. Like I talk to caregivers all the time. If you don't model these things, it's not going to get reinforced no matter what I teach them in this 1 hour lesson once a week. So if you want your child to stop looking at their phone during dinner time, then you need to put your phone away during dinner time. If you want your child to learn how to appropriately respond to something, tell them, you know what, someone sent me a message today and it really upset me. And here's what I did.
Here's what I didn't do.
Yeah, here's what I saw this tweet and it made me mad, but you know what? Responding to that isn't really going to help me, or I'm not sure if this is true. So I went to here to figure out and like fact and verify because I know there's a lot of misinformation. Like having those conversations, that is what's going to be necessary to pushing the culture forward in terms of dealing with social media as a part of how we function.
Because if you're not in that world with your kids, their peers are going to be.
Yep.
Anyone else? Questions, comments for the wonderful Dr. Leandra Paris? Okay, then. Well, Leandra, we want to thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you for sharing your fantastic insights, and we'll see you again in a podcast sometime in the future.
Yes, I'm gonna go to bed because it's 10:30 here.
All right.
So time for me to. My elections are done, and I'm gonna go.
All right. Thank you, Leandra.
All right. Good night.
So that's our last Zoom, right?
Yeah.
Alrighty then.
So we're into C.
Well, so I guess you're all looking to me to.
We are looking to you.
Overarching
Take us home.
observations about the evening, and I think that what I want to do is shift focus to some of the results that we've seen come in, and maybe we can see if we can draw some inferences or some kind of implications or conclusions, perhaps even from them. So,
or just maybe be triggered.
yeah, I suppose. Well, so going into the night, obviously you had a trifecta in Washington with the Democratic Party having the presidency, the Senate, right? It's 50-50, right? But then the Kamala Harris, is the vice president's vote, kind of breaks that tie. But of course, you've had the filibuster as a major issue in the Senate politics that's held up a lot of Biden's agenda, among other things. And then the House obviously is a razor-thin margin for the Democrats currently, and so. It was expected to be. I mean, there was all this pontificating about kind of a red wave getting into this, and right now it looks like there's a lot of these races that are neck and neck, and it looks like the Republicans have flipped 5 seats in the Senate. I'm sorry, in the House. The Senate is still neck and neck, and so we've been kind of watching. Some of the results go in as we're going, and there's some big announcements that might actually kind of give us an indication where things might go. So first of all. They just called the governor's race in Pennsylvania for Shapiro, the Democrat, and Fetterman's currently winning, and it looks like if you had people that were going to vote kind of a Democratic ticket, and again, people may have been turned off by Mastriano, this very kind of aggressive extremist kind of figure that's very polarizing. It's very possible that Fetterman may prevail, and that would flip a seat for the Democrats in the Senate. The Georgia race between Warnock and Kershaw Walker is very tight. It's kind of going back and forth. And the thing to keep in mind is that in Georgia, if none of the candidates get above 50%, then it goes to a runoff, which is what we saw in 2020. So, and there's a Libertarian independent candidate running that's sucking about 2% from the vote. So it'll be interesting to see where this goes. Some other notable races. There's some vote splitting that's occurring. So in Georgia, we're seeing kind of vote splitting where people who are voting for Kemp are also voting for Warnock. That's in Georgia. In New Hampshire, you're seeing people voting for Sununu. They call it the race for Sununu, the Republican for governor, but there's vote splitting with Hassan, the Democratic candidate for Senate. In Ohio, you saw vote splitting between DeWine, who they called very early the Republican governor, and then others voting for Tim Ryan, the Democratic candidate. And what's interesting about these vote splits is that it shows you kind of a sliver of the electorate that is rejecting a Trump-endorsed candidate, right? So that's something that, again, is kind of interesting. Obviously, locally here, Pritzker won, which I think we talked about. Huh?
No, locally? Oh, Illinois. Yes, sorry. Yes,
sorry.
I thought you were talking about McLean County.
Yeah. McLean. No, he didn't win. He may not have won McLean County, but and so we're watching that. Some other notable figures in these kind of nationalized politics that we're talking about, right? So one of the members of the January 6th committee, a congresswoman from Virginia, Lumia, she lost. She's a Democrat, but Lauren Boebert, who's a very polarizing member from Colorado, who kind of flamboyantly uses guns as a prop for her branding. She's currently losing. So there's some interesting moves there. I think one of the things that's also going to be interesting coming out of this evening in terms of the national political race for the presidency is obviously Florida went for DeSantis very early, and Rubio won as well. And so it remains to be seen if Rubio will run for president, but DeSantis clearly has the presidency on his mind.
Yeah.
And so, and Trump made an announcement, a couple of days ago, basically kind of previewing an imminent announcement next week. Which most people presume is going to be an announcement to run for president in 2024. And what's interesting here is that you've got this potential head-on collision between DeSantis and Trump, where you have Trump and then you have somebody who's tried to emulate his kind of style of politics. And so I think what's going to be interesting over the next 2 years, presumably if these two candidates go neck and neck with each other, and presumably these being the two front runners within the Republican Party, is what happens when one of them loses? Do they concede and they back them? Do they ask one to join the ticket? I think if DeSantis were to overtake Trump, which is not out of the realm of possibility, what does that Trump loyal vote do? Do they back DeSantis? Or does Trump potentially split the Republican Party? And that's something else that again, I think that is always been kind of in the background with Trump as a figure. Trump is not going to take, he's not going to be anybody's vice president.
No.
Right? So, I mean, DeSantis very well, I think DeSantis could be a vice president. But that's something I think that will be interesting moving forward. There was all these predictions of a Democratic kind of bloodbath. We're not really seeing it.
No.
I mean, it's still early, and there's still a lot of these states to be resolved, but we're not really seeing that. We're seeing, in fact, actually that kind of like in 2020 relative to 2016, it was just sort of a few vote shifts here and there.
Yeah.
And the general kind of balance of power didn't really shift that much in dramatic ways. So again, this is as of what, 9:40
Yeah,
p.m.
right.
Central Time, so obviously anything can happen. But I mean, those are some things that I've noticed just kind of watching the election results come in. I'm curious what y'all think.
So I want to ask you about this vote splitting, where people seem to be rejecting Trump-endorsed candidates.
In some instances.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
is that a sort of pruning of the Republican Party? In the sense that if DeSantis were to run in 24, he might actually be running with a Republican Party that's more like a Republican Party. So in other words, there's an edge. If Trump aspects of the party are being pruned out now by people voting these split tickets, then it creates a party that may look more like what we would call a traditional Republican Party, and that just seems to me that pruning would continue, and they would probably fall more in favor of DeSantis than Trump, because Trump is Trump and it's never not going to be Trump. And DeSantis, I think, can play a bit more of a suave game if you want, so it's not much more suave. But anyway, I just thought that was interesting that the Republican Party might be pruning itself at the moment.
Potentially. I mean, this is where, these different, like the Lincoln Project or like, these Never Trump Republicans.
Exactly.
This is where they become interesting because they raise a lot of money. They reach a national audience. They're always represented on like the cable news channels.
Yes.
Whether it's Charlie Sykes or Steve Schmidt. Or,
Yep.
Steve Schmidt has kind of fallen by the wayside. There was a lot of controversy with the Lincoln Project. But I mean, nonetheless, I mean, their stated goal is to try to do that pruning.
Yeah.
And I guess the question though becomes, where do those pruned voters go, right? Because they kind of they're kind of
right.
They don't really have a party at that point. And again, I think and that becomes interesting. Like who absorbs them? I mean, do they in 2020 presumably they voted for a Biden, right? I don't know. I mean but that's a lot can happen between now and.
Well, it is 2 years, right?
Yeah,
and your ideas can change in 2 years.
Of course.
And what I'm saying is, when it becomes uncool to be so publicly hateful.
Yes.
When that falls out of social favor, and it's not getting the number of people endorsing it is decreasing. It's not where you want to be for identity validation anymore.
Yeah.
So you migrate somewhere else. You just do it quietly over a year and don't say anything for a while, and then come out 6 months before the election. Pro middle of the road.
Yeah. I think it's something else to kind of look for out of these results is some of these candidates. What kind of rhetorical style will kind of emerge as sort of like maybe a style that others try to emulate, right? I mean, so I think Shapiro's candidacy is interesting because he's going up against a explicit election denier. He's going up against a Trump-backed candidate, and again, this is a major swing state, and he just won basically 56% of the vote. And he's also outpacing Fetterman by 5 points. And so what becomes interesting is each one of these candidacies becomes something of a laboratory, right? And so it becomes interesting to see if this becomes sort of a style that others emulate. Right, and again, what a lot of people remarked about Shapiro's candidacy is that he found a way to campaign very effectively for a kind of multicultural liberal democracy, and to explicitly run against a candidate that had a very kind of, we're talking about fixed mindset, right? A very kind of fixed sense of this is who Americans are, this is who Americans are not. And that's the when you start kind of creating this this is a candidate in Macerano that had a very clear sense of this is an in-group, here's an out-group, and there was a very kind of demagogic element to this candidate's appeal and to this candidate's rhetorical strategy. And you're seeing that in other instances too, in the Arizona governor's race, Johnson as well, in the Senate race in Wisconsin, all of these candidates are losing at the moment. And so, I don't, it's still early in the night, but that is, if we're talking about from the beginning, what is going to be the discourse of civic engagement and of civic repair?
Yeah.
Well, maybe we're seeing test cases where there may be some cases that we can see, okay, well, maybe this becomes something that's emulatable, that can actually create the kind of, or like move it in the direction of these kinds of things that we were talking about at the very beginning. So, there's some hope.
One of the things that you said about Shapiro and Fetterman, I think, is really, really interesting. And I think I saw Shapiro's closing argument, right, that he gave, and I thought it was one of the most effective that I've seen in a long time. For Fetterman, do you think if he refused to debate, that he wins by a bigger margin, or is that bigger?
Or his health. I mean, that's the other factor. Like his health, his stroke is a major variable in this, and that may be something that's bringing him down. That's a very good point. But again, this is a very kind of Fetterman. I mean, the guy wears like, you've seen he wears like a hoodie in campaigns, right? And so this is a very kind of different kind of appeal. Scott, you're talking about like the decimation of the middle class and the kind of union kind of middle class. This is somebody who explicitly runs on that kind of a platform and makes that kind of a stylistic appeal. Do you know what I mean? All the way down to his dress.
Yeah.
And so this is another figure that has been kind of looked at as, is this the kind of candidate that can actually kind of win over? I mean, we talked about like the white working class basically kind of falling, Vanessa talked about this, a lot of us have been talking about this, right? The way in which the white upper class was able to leverage racial politics and scapegoating to then enact these changes, these policy changes that have created more inequality. And then the scapegoats become then, convenient, way of providing a psychic outlet for your frustrations when it becomes projected into this kind of polarization, instead of kind of recognizing that the policies that have been kind of in place for many decades have had these results. Do you know what I mean? But so that's, again, these are some things that are interesting that are coming out of this evening. So those are my thoughts.
Well, I have a question for you though. So, of course, I'm looking closely at what's going on in Georgia. So not only the Abrams and Kemp, but also with Walker and Warnock, right? So I'm wondering, you talked a little bit about these rhetorical strategies, and so I wonder, I know it has to be, the person has to get to 50%, right? But I just wonder, how do you think that, and I'm going to say this is Walker's strategy probably is this kind of rhetoric of redemption now, right? Do you think that works? I'm just thinking about kind of how we hear the candidacy of some of the people, right? And I don't know where to place Walker within, I guess probably more Trump style politics, I guess. Well, we could probably put them on that same kind of level of intellectualism, maybe, right? But I wonder, do you see that? That was my little soft way of talking about that. But I wonder if you see, that as a new, well, it's not new, but that rhetoric kind of replaces some of the rhetoric that Walker was using earlier, right? With talking about abortion and stuff, right? So now it's kind of, I don't know if it's necessarily Walker who did that, but people around Walker that started talking about redemption, right? And this became after these women came forward, saying that Walker paid for the abortions, right? And of course, it's the South, right? It's the Baptist Church South, right? So I wonder how that might play into the future. You were talking about this future of politics also, right? I wonder how that might play into the future of politics. And of course, we know that religion is nothing new in politics, right? Coming out as rhetorical strategy. But I wonder, let's say Walker did win. Do you think that plays a role into the outcome of that, right? And then I'm going to kind of ask another question about this, right? How does that play into this role of, so we'll go to you first and then to you, into this role of thinking about empathy and hope, right? Because for some people, empathy and hope is going to kind of be wrapped up also in this notion of religion. Right? You can't separate that, but does it become dangerous at that point? So why don't you start, and then I'd like to hear you respond to that also.
Well, I mean, I think those are good points. I think that the move to redemption is another kind of rhetorical strategy that clearly became part of the nationalized politics. You're absolutely right. I think that it's a particular move that people make when they're in a kind of crisis like Walker was in. And I think that it's indicative of just how polarized everything is, right? Because it allows somebody to then play the whataboutism card to redeem themselves, and they go through this whole Christian rhetoric of redemption, which again appeals to a large audience, right? I mean, that was meant to kind of get the base out, and it didn't sink his candidacy. I mean, it remains to be. So right now there's 700,000 votes remaining, and there's a 40,000 vote split. We don't know where the outstanding vote is, but the fact that it's neck and neck and it hasn't been called yet suggests how effective that was, right? And again, you had a number of people who were basically kind of like coming to Walker's defense from all over, right? So absolutely. I mean, that's another narrative strategy that we'll see, and we'll see more in it. And it's just indicative of the polarization, right? Because again, it kind of I think the question that the way I think we kind of put that your observation and the concepts that we've been talking about here is, if we have these structural incentives for driving this polarization, if we have in-group, out-group dynamics that manifest themselves in television viewing habits and social media practices where they're literally in kind of a bubble of confirmation bias for their own beliefs. And if they go to that for fulfillment and kind of psychic energy or psychic, kind of mana, as we've been talking about, to try to kind of like, to give them the permission structure to go ahead and vote for somebody who, purportedly wants to ban abortion in all conditions except for himself.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? And then lies about it. Right? I mean, that does speaks to a dehumanization in a different way.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Because it's not just necessarily dehumanizing the other, it's also, it creates a level of kind of it creates a standard where as long as you're on my team, you can do whatever you want.
Yes.
And it becomes these are the norms that break down a rule of law. Do you know what I mean? And so that's I think that's what I think.
No, I think you're absolutely right. So this is not cynical. This is hopefully descriptive. The rhetorical advantage that a Christian has is they can choose the Old Testament or the New Testament. The Old Testament is a mad God. All right? The Old Testament is a patriarchal God of non-forgiveness. It's the New Testament where Jesus came to the fore that we have a God of forgiveness. So moving the evangelical crowd through the Old Testament into the New Testament is brilliant. It's politically brilliant because what it allows them to do is, dare I say, take any dehumanizing experiences they may have had of Herschel Walker. Yes, you're redeeming yourself in our eyes. We're welcoming you into this world of us. So when I say it's brilliant, I might be being cynical, but I mean, you said you're on my team no matter what. So what's being sustained is that they're going to support this person. What's changing is the version of the Bible they used to do it. That sounds like late night talk, but that's always been the advantage of an Old Testament, New Testament rhetoric, is you can pick whichever one you want at the moment to justify choosing the person you're person. And when you go the redemption route, you get to be virtuous for forgiving them, right? And that makes you feel good, and everybody feels good.
Right. Yeah.
I hate to cut the conversation off, but if people at home can see that we're in a transition where TV10 is about to take over this space, so we probably should wrap it up at this point. Awesome, amazing conversation through the
Fantastic,
evening.
you guys.
Great speakers and perspectives from students and all of that I thought was just outstanding and great wrap up of where we stand. Of course, there's a lot we'll know tomorrow and in the days that come. There's a lot that we don't know right now. But do we want to end by just kind of sharing where you can all be contacted on social media if people are looking to connect with you?
Certainly. So I'm, again, Byron Craig, and you can find me on Facebook and Instagram. Byron. Scott laughs at this because every time we do a podcast, I'm like, what are those things that I use?
I got you.
It's funny that you don't use Twitter.
Yeah, so Byron Steve on Instagram, and then on Twitter. I'm still on there. It's Dr. Byron Craig, but I don't know how much longer I'll be on there. But I'm also at the School of Communication, so.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, you can find me at the School of Communication. I'm also on LinkedIn.
You can find me on YouTube at the Dark Loops Productions channel, where we have conversations like this all the time. The five of us. We got to give a shout out to Nathan, by the way. The
Dr.
camera hasn't
Carpenter!
been on, but come on behind the scenes, get yourself in frame, young man. But Dr. Nathan Carpenter has been frantically running things behind the scenes. We very much appreciate his work. The five of us get together. We do a little show called The Divide, and we talk about these very sorts of issues.
Yeah, and you can find me at the School of Communications website as well. So thank you all. Awesome panel. Thank you all for tuning in. Have a great night.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Stay hopeful.
Exactly.